All right. Waiting for everybody to get back. Okay. Okay, just want to make sure I got everybody back, and we do. Okay, so in just a second, I'm going to ask us to maybe volunteer 1 or 2 people from each group. I may call on somebody, things like that. Let's get some participation. We're gonna answer the question, what is life? And you may be asking yourself that question at the end of the week. You're like, oh my gosh, I'm so stressed. What is life? But we want to know what classifies something as a living thing. Does anybody want to start us off? And you can either raise your hand or unmute yourself. Something that you discussed in your group. What makes something living?
Yeah,
all right. All right. I think, let's see here. Is that Sam?
Yep.
All right, Sam, what's something that makes something living?
Yeah, what the group and I came up with was one thing was being made of cells.
Yeah.
Another one is reacting to stimuli.
See if I can add more. Those are good. I'm going to ask for another one. Barbara, did you have one?
Yeah, also mentioned reproduction.
We're having a hard time hearing you. Will you say that one more time?
We mentioned in the group reproduction.
Oh, I'm having a hard time hearing you. Maybe you could you write it in the chat? There's some background noise.
So she was part of our group and she was mainly saying like reproduction and growth.
Thank you. Okay, good one, Barbara. Thanks. I just couldn't hear you. Reproduction and growth. All right, who else has one?
Our group talked about requiring materials and energy.
Yeah, that's a good one. Good. Yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Our group had the capability to interact with the environment.
Yeah, I like that one. Hopefully you guys can see some of those on the whiteboard. Are there any others? Did every group get a chance to share something? All right, well, good job. You guys hit the nail on the head with those. Hopefully you have a list right there, but what we're gonna do is, let's see here, stop the share. We're gonna go back to the PowerPoint somewhere. Here it is. Thanks for your patience, everyone. There's a lot of clicking. Perfect. Okay, so we're back to points to ponder. Perfect. All right, so what characteristics are shared by living organisms? So living organisms, they are organized from the atom to the biosphere. So essentially we are made up of tiny living cells in our body. And those cells break down to itty bitty atoms. You've maybe heard of somebody like splitting an atom before, and this is like being a super big thing on the news a couple of years ago. It's a big deal. Those are itty bitty. You can't see an atom. You can't see a cell with your plain eye. You'd have to use a microscope. So living things are organized and characterized from atom to biosphere. And biosphere is the big living environment that you live in. Let me see, there's a great picture in your book and it will come up here on the PowerPoint as well. But page 3, it looks like this. That's a great one for some exam questions. The biosphere, like it says, is the regions of the Earth's crust, the water, the atmosphere, the inhabited by living organisms. So everything from the atom to the biosphere, that's what characterizes life. Then we have the use of materials and energy from the environment. And one of the groups said that in just a little bit different wording. So essentially what that means is the rock that's sitting outside on the side of the road does not need materials. It doesn't need sunlight. It doesn't need water. It doesn't need food like we do. Even though you may say that you have a pet rock and they do require some attention, they are not a living thing. Then we have maintain a relatively constant internal environment, homeostasis. So has any of you guys gone outside today? Yeah, I've been outside. I walked my dog, Lloyd. We walked by I live near an elementary school and my dog was like curious as to why they were not playing with him. He was very sad about that. The kids were outside at recess. But when I was outside, oh my gosh, I started to sweat. And thank goodness that I started to sweat and that my body understands homeostasis, because if not, my internal organs probably would start to overheat and we wouldn't want that. Same thing when your car overheats. You don't want that, right? Check engine light may come on. But what we have as living organisms is a constant internal environment, homeostasis. So when I start to sweat, you know, you perspire, maybe you're working out or you're stressing out about something, your body is having some sort of physical reaction in order to maintain what's normal on the inside of your body, right? Because our main goals for our body in life is pretty much to like breathe and pump some blood and, you know, have some sort of process in doing that. So those are what our body wants to continue to do. Oops, sorry, I clicked ahead and I didn't mean to do that. Then we have respond to internal and external stimuli. I give the example usually as like when you were a little kid, maybe, or me last week. I did this. I was cooking some muffins in the oven and I went to take them out of the oven and oh my gosh, I touched my hand to the oven. It was so hot. I responded to that external stimuli by pulling my hand away. Thank goodness that our bodies have that reaction, or I would have just held onto that oven and been like, wow, this is great. I want to have some chocolate muffins. And then my hand burns and then I, you know, damage my hand. We're able to respond to that external stimuli to save our body. Our body does not want my hand to burn off, right? I need my hand for other things like learning and driving my car and all of that, walking my dog. But also think about a plant. How does a plant respond to external stimuli? Does anybody have like a plant in their dorm room or a succulent? I have a succulent and you know what? Every week or 2 weeks, I have to rotate my succulent because it starts to go towards the window. It starts to go towards the sun. It's responding to that external stimuli. And if I do that, then my succulent starts to, you know, limp and fall over. So I have to like rotate it so that it starts to tilt towards the sun the other way. So also living things respond to that external or internal stimuli. The ability to reproduce and grow, rocks can't reproduce. We can reproduce as humans. Plants, pollination, they can reproduce. Those are some things that characterize something to be living. And lastly, have an evolutionary history through which organisms change over time. Maybe you took a high school class or a high school biology class and learned about Darwin's finches, or how different types of birds have different sizes of beaks and different shapes that allow them to adapt to their environment and eat certain things. So if a really long, skinny bird beak is like this, and it's really good for getting worms out of the ground, or maybe there's a bird beak that's super round and it's good for crunching on seeds and nuts. If you put a bird that has a really long beak in an environment where they need to be eating, you know, seeds or bugs, they're not going to be doing very well. So over time, through mutations and fitness, which we'll talk about that a little bit, the evolutionary history, organisms change over time. You've maybe also heard that like humans are a little bit taller over time nowadays than they were 300 years ago. We're evolving to different things over time, but that doesn't mean that I'm like, you know what? I want to play basketball. Like I played soccer in college. I want to play basketball now. So I'm just going to evolve and I'm just going to grow 12 inches and be like 6'7". Like that would be sick, right? No, that's not really how things change over time. It's through mutations. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. It's through many, many, many years, lots of reproduction and generations that allow that evolutionary change. All right. So here's that picture I told you about that's also on page 3. Figures are super great. They help you understand things. This one is just showing that there's an atom way at the bottom. That atom makes up molecules that make up cells. Cells make up tissues that make up organs. Okay, so maybe you kind of recognize that picture. That's a brain. Hopefully yours is still turned on, even though it's 1:55 on a Tuesday, or not Tuesday, wow, Friday, mine's not turned on. Nervous system, so then the organs make up organ systems. Organ systems make up an organism. We are organisms, as you can see. That's a little picture of me wearing a toga. I'm just kidding. It's just a picture in the book of some sort of human in the beginning of time. Then lots of organisms make up a population. So you could call this class a population, but the community would then necessarily be Wartburg. You guys are in the population class of Bio 130. The community is at Wartburg. The ecosystem would be maybe in Iowa or the United States, and then the biosphere would be Earth. So that's a good descriptive picture. I think that's a really good representation of how things are organized. Okay, so how do we classify humans? This is just a whole bunch of scientific words. I'm sure that maybe you recognize a few of them. A human, maybe you've heard of the word Homo sapien. That's just a scientific term. It's the genus and the species. In science, we classify organisms or talk about things by their genus and their species. It's how we classify things. And there's also how you classify a house cat. And it goes through that. So as you can see, a human and a house cat are both in the domain Eukarya and the kingdom Animalia. So far we've got 2 things in common with cats. And then the phylum, we're the same. Class, we're getting pretty similar to cats here. And then as you get down to the order, family, genus, species, it gets more and more specific as to what that organism is. I've done research in my undergrad on Symbiodinium. I've done research on things that have like a lot of weird names, and it's just how we define something and how we classify it. Don't worry, you don't need to memorize this slide. It's just saying, how do we classify humans? How do we classify things? We order them from domain to species, and the more specific we are, the better that becomes. Okay, what distinguishes humans? Okay, so why are we different than the house cat? What distinguishes us? So there's that cultural heritage or patterns of our behavior passed on from one generation to the next. Maybe you can think of something that like you have in common with your parents or your guardians or whoever when you're growing up. Maybe there's something about your behavior that you recognize, a pattern, a cultural heritage. We have highly developed brains. Okay, so you guys are all in college now. You're very highly developed. You guys are on your way to success. But other than that, think about like a baby or like a puppy. You know, everybody in that maybe group that I just mentioned has brains, but ours are highly developed. We're completely upright in our stance. So like I said, the example with my dog, he walks on 4 legs. They're very small and they're very cute, but we're upright in our stance and we're very unique in that sense. Whereas like a cow or a horse, they have 4 legs. They are on all 4 of their limbs. We have creative language skills. Other animals have different language and creativity with that. Some birds, bats, things like that. But ours is very creative, very intuitive. We can vary our tool use. Like, I mean, come on, we all have a phone or a computer that we're using. Great tool. You know, we can use tools. Like I can lift up my glass of water, having that cognitive behavior and the ability to do so. And the modification of our environment for our own purpose, which may threaten the biosphere. So we are able to build a house so that when hurricane-like winds come, it somewhat protects us. We have the ability to think, oh, if sometime it rains while I'm sleeping, I'm not going to be wanting to sleep outside, so I'm going to build a house to live in. We have the ability to think that, build or change our environment in order to benefit us, but it also may threaten the biosphere. So that's just understanding that, like, knocking down trees or building a bridge or a dam, we understand and can use that to, oh, I'm going the wrong way, modify our environment. What do we know about science? So science is, this is a great definition, a way of knowing about the natural world. It's pretty much accumulation of a whole bunch of different experiments that scientists have done throughout the years in order to give you some knowledge of this stuff. It wasn't just like somebody sat down someday and said, you know what, I think we're made up of atoms. And I think that there's a little itty bitty thing that makes up our cells. And maybe that was true, but also they probably ran many experiments to figure that out. And then they publish them in journals. They have information that comes from that, and that's what makes up your textbooks these days, or information that you learn in your science classes. Science and scientists should be objective. So understanding the term between subjective and objective, so not having bias. If I go to do a study on dogs, I probably shouldn't pick my dog Lloyd as part of that experiment because I'd be super biased. Scientific conclusions may change or be modified as our understanding and technology increase. There are things in my high school textbooks that I learned for science that as I progressed throughout my undergraduate and my master's degree that are different in science now. We know more about science every single day throughout the years, and it's always changing and adapting because we know we have more knowledge, we have more technology. And science is studied using the scientific method, and we'll talk about that next. So some scientific theories in biology, understanding the difference between a theory and a law. So a theory is something that's probably been used in an experiment multiple times, and we have a good idea of what that is. A law is something that happens no matter what. Like if I pick up my phone and I drop it, the law of gravity, I just woke my dog up now. The law of gravity says that every time it'll happen, no matter what. But a theory is something that we have very good knowledge about or have been tested many times, but it's possible that it could be tested against as well. So a theory, the cell theory, is that all organisms are composed of cells and new cells only come from pre-existing cells. So that's a theory. Homeostasis is like I talked about when you go outside and you start sweating. This is the internal environment of organisms stays relatively constant. It's also the reason why if you're sick, you start to have a fever. Your body is reacting to something internal or external in order to live. That's our body's goal, is to keep pumping blood, keep breathing. Genes, organisms contain coded information that dictates their form, function, and behavior. Ecosystem, populations of organisms interact with each other in the physical environment. Evolution, all organisms have common ancestor, but each is adapted to a particular way of life. So these are different theories like I talked about. They are scientific theories in biology. We have a lot of evidence to say that these are true, but it doesn't mean that we've proven them to be true. There's a difference. Okay, gotta find my mouse again and let's click to the next slide. So the steps of the scientific method. This would be a great homework or test question, wouldn't you say? The steps of the scientific method, you start with an observation. So if I wanted to do an experiment, I could say, what's an example? I noticed that my dog is sleeping in his crate. I'm sorry that I'm using my dog as an example. I promise to use other examples sometime. So I made an observation. I'm like, why is my dog sleeping in his crate? You know, the door is open. He has a bed right over here. Why is my dog sleeping in his crate? Then I develop a hypothesis. Then I say, if I'm in the room and my dog is sleeping in the crate, then, you know, he feels more comfortable or whatever it is. you make a prediction and perform. So maybe for the next couple of days, I'm going to sit in the room and while he takes a nap and see if he naps in his crate or in his bed. Then I collect and analyze data. So maybe I do that for like 30 days and I collect data and I record whether or not my dog is taking a nap in his bed or in his crate. Then I develop a conclusion. And you know what? Most of the time, those conclusions are, I can't make a conclusion. I can't prove that hypothesis because proving a hypothesis is impossible. You could do an experiment three times or 30,000 times, and you can't prove something in science. You can suggest or say that my hypothesis was if I'm in the room, then my dog will be sleeping in the crate. And it didn't happen 100% of the time. So my hypothesis is rejected and I will have to maybe test this 100 days next time instead of 30. So that's kind of the steps of the scientific method. Okay, here's a figure. It's also in your book on page, let me find it. Page 10, figure 1.7. The scientific method. Essentially, it's exactly what that last slide said, but it's walking through it in a little bit different way. So you start with that observation at the top, that's in that blue part. Then you go down, you have maybe a couple different hypotheses or a potential hypothesis. Maybe you make a prediction from there. Then you go on to the experiment and maybe something happened and you have to reject it. It didn't work, right? 30 days wasn't enough for me to observe my dog and whether or not, if I'm in the room, he's going to sleep in his crate or his bed. So then I reject hypothesis 1. But as you can see, then it draws an arrow down and it goes to, from that experiment, I can make another hypothesis. I could say, you know, maybe my dog likes to sleep in his crate when it's early afternoon. Maybe at 1 or 2 o'clock, he likes to sleep in his crate. And then I have some predictions from that. And then I experiment. And I reject or accept my hypothesis, and you just kind of keep working down. And then maybe you get different experiments from that, you have predictions confirmed, and then you make a conclusion. That's the scientific method. So here's a little bit about variables. Variables in a controlled study, so experimental variables is that variable that is purposefully changed or manipulated. All other variables need to remain constant. So in my dog example, it wouldn't be a good idea for me to come over to Wartburg and test whether or not my dog is also sleeping in his crate or bed at Wartburg. I should probably keep it fairly constant. I should keep the temperature in my house pretty constant. I should keep the location of his crate and his bed constant. I should maybe do it at the same time. And then maybe I manipulate it some sort of variable. And that could be any of those things that I was controlling. Maybe one of the experiments I do want to see if it's just at my house, he sleeps in his crate. Maybe if I brought him to my sister's dorm room, my sister goes to Wartburg, by the way, then maybe he'd sleep in his bed. So an experimental variable is something that you're purposely changing or manipulating to see how it works in an experiment. Now, there are different things in science. Not everything is an experiment. You could go out to the Cedar River and observe ducks and see what those ducks are doing and maybe make some observations. That'd be an observational study. You're not manipulating anything. You're just looking at some ducks. An experimental experiment or experimental variable is something that a scientist manipulates in order to see how it reacts, but keeping as many variables constant as possible in order to look at that one specific thing. So we have different groups. We have a test group and a control group. The test group is a group of subjects that are exposed to the experimental variable. So my dog would be considered a test group. The control group maybe is something that is not exposed to that experimental variable. And this is a little bit harder in the example that I gave. But for example, maybe you were testing, I did an experiment in my undergrad and you guys will laugh at this, but I wanted to test how fish, like itty bitty zebrafish, would react if I put them in a tank of Gatorade. I'm much smarter and more advanced in my science career now than that. But my experiment was, I wanted to see if these little itty bitty fish would survive in a tank of Gatorade. There's some water in Gatorade, right? Just to let you know, those fish did not make it to the end of the experiment, but my control group was that I had a tank of fish in normal water that was not affected by the test group at all. So that was kind of, so I wanted to test what fish were doing in a tank of Gatorade. My control group was fish in the same environment in the classroom in normal filtered water that they needed. So that's just another example of a test group versus a control group. All right, a controlled study in action. This is figure 1.9. It is on page 13 of your book. I know that maybe the text is a little small on there, so it's a little bit better if you're looking at it in your book and following along. So the first part, it says, state a hypothesis. So antibiotic, does everybody kind of know what an antibiotic is? You've maybe gone to the doctor before and maybe with an earache and they give you an antibiotic. An antibiotic is something that kills bacteria. You do not give somebody an antibiotic if they have the flu, because the flu is a virus. Coronavirus can't be cured by an antibiotic. Antibiotic B is a better treatment for ulcers than antibiotic A. So that hypothesis is just saying we've got two different antibiotics here and we're thinking that B is going to be a little bit better than A. So we performed that experiment and the groups were treated the same except as noted. There was a control group and they received a placebo, which is probably just a pill filled with sugar. And they thought they were taking an antibiotic. This group had no idea that they did not take an antibiotic and it was just a sugar pill. Test group 1 received antibiotic A and test group 2 received antibiotic B, and they collected data. Each subject was examined for the presence of ulcers. And then at the bottom, you can see the graph. And understanding graphs is really important in science. You have an X and a Y axis, you have a title. The title should tell you a little bit more about what that experiment was, as if somebody off the street who had no idea what we were talking about could come in and read this graph. I would even say that this graph title lacks a little bit. Effectiveness of treatment. But I'm thinking the teacher in me is like, of what? So the percent of treated ulcers is on the y-axis, and then control group, and test group 1 and 2 are across that x-axis, and that's percent of ulcers cured. So as you can see, test group 2 had a higher percentage of the percent of ulcers treated, and that was the orange group, test group that was taking antibiotic B. So what can we just say flat out that antibiotic B is better than A? Yeah, what we can say is that we can accept our hypothesis based on our data. Now, if we were to run this study 1,000 times, and maybe this only took into account maybe 100 people, we may see that a different result. So we're only accepting our hypothesis that we're doing. We're not saying that antibiotic B is 100% always better than antibiotic A. All right, moving on. So how the cause of ulcers was discovered, the scientific method in action. So what I said in that last picture was that we had observations that many patients had a particular bacterium near their ulcers. They made a hypothesis. So that's a certain bacterium right there is the cause of gastritis or ulcers. So this is an observation. They made a hypothesis, working through that scientific method. The experiment and the observation. So the first, that bacteria was isolated and grown from the ulcer patient. So you can grow bacteria in like a little plate, and it's not like a plate you would put in the microwave. It's a good medium for growing bacteria, and then humans swallowing that bacterium solution developed inflammation in their stomach. So now they swallowed this bacteria. They gave them a pill that had that bacteria in them, and it had some inflammation in their stomachs. What they could conclude from that was that the cause of most of the ulcers can be cured by antibiotics. Fairly good experiment, and guess what? Scientists are doing this all the time to be able to have modern medicine that we do in order to cure the earache that you go to the doctor for. All right, we're getting towards the end of these slides. Are you guys staying with me? I'm trying to push through so that on this Friday, on the first day of class, I don't keep you till 2:55. You guys good with that? Yeah, I thought so. Okay, So reading about scientific information. So I talked a little bit about how the science in your textbooks and the things that you're reading about are a series of hundreds of thousands of experiments that people have done throughout the years in order to gain knowledge about the natural world. That's what science is. And you can go into the Vogel Library online if you want to and just like read about more science, because I think that's what you guys are wanting to do for your weekend. And there's a bunch of scientific journals, and they are considered sources of information of different experiments that scientists have done, but they can be kind of difficult to read for the average person. I remember at the beginning of my undergrad, I maybe wouldn't have understood a science journal as much as I do now. Just understanding different terminology, understanding how experiments are run, what different things mean, understanding the process. So a scientific journal, if I were to assign one, which I'm not, don't worry, you would have maybe a hard time reading it. And it's not to doubt anything or any of your guys' abilities or anything like that. It's just science is a weird language sometimes. And I even have a hard time reading some journals, just if they're like really difficult. And sometimes this isn't me, but sometimes scientists like to kind of like flex their science knowledge, and they'll like say all these big words in this journal article, even though all they wanted to say was red blood cells are round with a little dome-like shape, inverted. And that's all they wanted to say, but then they'd throw out all these big words to make themselves sound a little smarter. But don't worry, that's not me. Often a person reads secondary sources and it must be wary of the information and taken out of context. So Wikipedia is a secondary source. So people can post to Wikipedia. I think Wikipedia has gotten better throughout the years, but there's also reviews out there or peer reviews that understand articles a little bit better than the actual journal article itself. So a journal article would be something found in like Science Daily, or I'm trying to think of some other ones like Bio One, or some other journals that are out there. Those are going to be immediate, essentially lab reports, journal articles from the scientist about their experiment and their conclusions. They went through that scientific method. A secondary source would be like a peer-reviewed article. Somebody read that journal article and then kind of reviewed the information to give it a little bit more understanding to the average person, to like interpret all that weird science jargon or whatever that they say. So it says, be careful of information on the internet by using reliable sources such as URLs with .edu, .gov, and .org. These ones are going to be just a little bit more reliable than a .com. I think that throughout the years, this has gotten a little bit better. You've maybe learned about this I remember learning about it in middle school and high school, just making sure that you're using reliable sources. So if the question were to ask, what are some things that people should be hesitant about or understand for scientific information, just understanding what the source of information is. If the source of information was this article written by Alex Place, Masters of Biology, it might be a pretty good article. If it said Susie Smith from so-and-so, or would you maybe consider the article from Purdue University with these credentials of these 5 doctors who worked on this specific study for 10 years? I'd probably go with that one over an article written by me, but that's just me. All right, good. So what should you look for when you read about science? Be aware of the anecdotal data. So this is just like within that picture that we showed on page 13 about figure 110, right? At the bottom, we've got a graph there. And that graph showed that 80% of test group 2 treated those ulcers. I'm kind of going a little bit back. Being aware of what that data is actually saying. Maybe they tested 5 people and those were those results. Or maybe they tested 10,000 people and got those results. So understanding the data a little bit and kind of what did they get into here? Understanding the methodology and the results. So we talked about variables. If we changed way too many variables in an experiment, you can't really make a good conclusion from that, and understanding what those results would happen. So I go back to that example of my dog. If I changed a bunch of variables to determine whether he likes to sleep in his crate or his bed, and maybe I moved the crate and then I turned the heat up And then I opened the windows and played music. And, you know, I made too many changes, understanding the methods and how they affect the results. Because some scientists like to change too many variables, and then they make conclusions and results that aren't necessarily true. So does the data justify the conclusions inferred by the scientists? That's kind of the same thing. So be able to read a graph, which we're going to go over that, and then have some understanding of statistics. Has anybody taken statistics before? I have. It's kind of hard, but I made it through it. They told me I'd use it a lot when I, you know, got to grad school, and that wasn't true. So, all right. So reading a graph, what information does this line graph convey? So what I like to say when I'm reading a graph, or if somebody is creating a graph, if we pulled it off somebody in the hallway and we said, hey, so-and-so, come read this graph, and it said Lab 1 as the title. What is Lab 1? They didn't know. We've been talking about Lab 1 for weeks or whatever it was. We want to be able to read this graph and have the average Joe be able to come kind of read it off the street and say, oh, I know what they're looking at. So this graph is saying the variation in blood cholesterol levels. That's pretty descriptive. Then you have an x-axis, a y-axis, and you have some data. Those lines that look like really big letter I's. We got any Hawks fans out there? I, oh, no, okay. And then we have those standard error bars. You guys don't really need to know exactly what a standard error bar is. That's a little bit more statistical side. But then we have on the x-axis, we have week 1, 2, 3, and 4. And on the y-axis, you have blood cholesterol in milligrams per deciliter. Okay, so what it looks like is over the week and over different weeks, we can see a variation in the blood cholesterol levels of maybe a certain individual. And that's what this graph is telling us. It's telling us a story about what the experiment that they did. So it looks like they went for 4 weeks and they measured the blood cholesterol levels, and you can see how that varies, and it has some data there. All right, and then so it says, does science have a social responsibility? So we're kind of transitioning away from that graph a little bit. But so does science have a social responsibility? Science is a way of acquiring knowledge about the natural world. We talked about that. It is a slightly different endeavor than technology. So think about this. If we were to advance and have, oh, my headphones died. Can you guys still hear me okay? All right. If we were to advance technology and now our phones do, I mean, probably next year our phones are going to be doing something that I don't even know that's possible. There's things that help us with our lives. So think about like GPS. You have GPS on your phone. Does anybody still have like a Garmin GPS in their car or their family car? Yeah, I mean, my family used to have one, and then as soon as our phones could then connect either via Bluetooth or an aux cord into your car, you no longer need that Garmin GPS. So technology advances, but then science, we kind of have somewhat of a responsibility to keep advancing, right? If they were like, oh, we know what cancer is, that's no big deal, we don't need to keep advancing. Yeah, we kind of need to know more about cancer so that we can cure it. So there's somewhat of a social responsibility in science, whereas technology kind of just makes our life a little bit easier. Like now I know how to get somewhere. I don't have to remember anybody's phone numbers anymore because they're just in there in an address book. Does anybody still have their parents' phone numbers memorized? I still have my parents' phone numbers memorized, but I have a boyfriend we've been dating for almost 4 years now, and I don't have his phone number memorized. I just don't. So it's like technology has advanced. It's made our lives a little bit easier, where science has somewhat of that social obligation. It's like, oh, we have to advance science in order to cure cancer, cure COVID. Can you imagine if scientists were just like, COVID seems too hard, we'll just let this one slide? No, we've got scientists working on it all over the world, all over the United States, who have somewhat of this social obligation to just keep pushing forward. So like it says, technology is the application of scientific knowledge to the human interests. So yes, our phones are mini computers. It's for our human interests. It's that application of all that computer science that someone decided to make into a super handheld small device.
Bioethics. This term is the branch of ethics concerned with the developmental and the consequences of the biological technology. So genetic engineering, genetically modified crops. There's a big debate, understanding of genetically modified crops. But if you think about it, if we have an overpopulated world, and without genetically modified crops, we wouldn't be able to feed the world necessarily. Now, I'm not the biggest, I don't know a lot about agriculture as much because I never really focused on that, but to understand that there's some ethics as to like how can we adapt science in order to help, and how can we do that. But on the other side of it, there is a threat to biodiversity because of it. And we'll talk more about that in a little while. So human influence on the ecosystems. So humans tend to modify ecosystems for their own purpose. And I guess you could probably think of some examples of this. You've maybe heard of things like, we're tearing down the rainforests. Yeah, we are. Humans are out there somewhere tearing down ecosystems for our own benefit. And that is an issue, right? And there's a lot of issues like that. I mean, I could sit here and list 10, 12, 15, whatever, of different instances where humans are modifying that ecosystem for our own purpose, right? Maybe that's money. Maybe that's a business. Maybe that's to feed us. Whatever that is, doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. We don't need to sit here and debate that right now, but just understanding that humans do have an influence on the ecosystem. Changes in human behavior and the use of new technology can result in new diseases, emerging diseases. Can you imagine if there was a global pandemic and we didn't have internet and we didn't have TV? Or if we didn't have planes, or we didn't have automobiles or trains? Think of all these technology, all these things that have advanced, and now with changes in human behavior and the use of new technology, it can result in things. Think about how fast the coronavirus spread in the last 6-7 months, and how it changed if we wouldn't have had any technology. No phones, no planes, no cars, can't go anywhere. You can't even know that it's happening somewhere. Doesn't mean that it's not happening. The changes in human behavior and the technology can affect the outcome of some science things. Human activities may attribute to climate change. Big one, global warming, right? I did my undergraduate research on bleaching coral reefs, which was really cool. I got to go to Belize, and I got to understand why coral reefs are bleaching. So normally when you think of like coral, you think of like this orange branchy looking thing, but because of the rising carbon dioxide in the water and the rising ocean water temperatures, coral reefs are bleaching, and it's affecting the biodiversity of the ocean. I've also been told that in the next 5 to 10 years, the Great Barrier Reef won't look the same. Things like that. So human activities may attribute to that climate change. And what are some of those things? Maybe you've seen certain sunscreens that are safer to use in the oceans as opposed to just that copper tone that you use. Maybe that's attributing to some of that. Maybe it's the fossil fuels that we use that are going up in the air every single day. Luckily in Iowa, we don't have a ton of air pollution, but maybe if somebody in the room was from maybe a bigger city or a overpopulated area like New York, or some of the places a little bit south of us, I'm thinking of like in Arizona, New Mexico, they have, in LA especially, have air pollution issues because of how overpopulated it is, how much fossil fuel immersion is going into the sky, raising the carbon dioxide, raising the temperatures, climate change, global warming. Lots to be talked about there. Wish I could say more, but look at that. It is 2:30 and I got through the PowerPoint. Yay. Does anybody have any questions? I talked your ears off, your headphones off, whatever, for a good chunk of time here. Does anybody have any questions about anything that I talked about? Good. Yeah, so let's worry about what's next, right? So we have, let's see here. We have an assignment that's due on Monday. I believe that I had it turned off at 11:55 p.m. on August 31st. So even after, yes, Barbara, it is based off lecture. And you should be able to find that on my Wartburg, and I can stay a little bit here after class if you guys want to just kind of locate that. It's 5 questions. You should be able to answer it. The PowerPoints are also available, so you can kind of review through the book or the PowerPoints in order to answer those questions. Now, I fully aware that you could look it up in the book, and you could look up the question, the steps to the scientific method, and you could write it word for word verbatim from the textbook. Congratulations, you can read. I'd like to be able to see a little bit more understanding, and it's only for your own benefit. With this hybrid learning, we're going to have difficulties probably all semester. Maybe my internet goes out one day, or maybe your headphones don't work, or things like that. So we really have to focus on the time that we do have to order to learn this material. A lot of you are using this for a major requirement or a liberal arts requirement, and I get that. You won't need to memorize the scientific method and be able to tell somebody that when you're doing sociology or whatever you guys are doing, social work, but understanding how to learn and learn that material and understanding the concepts of an experiment can really maybe help you in a different way. So yes, the assignment is based off the lecture. You do have resources that will allow you to answer those questions fairly easily. I don't try and trick you or anything. It's just to help you refresh, okay, what did we talk about? These were some of those main points that Professor Alex wanted us to know, and it's also a good tool to refresh back to when you're studying for exams. Good question. What other questions do you guys have? Okay, so the next thing we have, like I said, is that assignment. And then on Monday we have lecture. It's in room 34. If you are the beginning of the alphabet, and that's by last name, I believe. I sent that email out and I took a screenshot of my attendance, and then I drew a line between the first half and the second half. If you did not receive that email, please stay after this Zoom call and I'll make sure that you have it. So the first half of the alphabet will be in person. Now, if you are quarantined, you're feeling sick, whatever, make sure you communicate with me. I'll be on Zoom at the exact same time. So 1:15 on Monday, whether you're in person or on Zoom, we'll set up the owl. I'll be standing up in front of the class. I'll be trying to talk to the computer, talking to everybody, making sure that everybody understands it. We'll be going over chapter 2. Then the chapter 2 assignment will be due on Friday. And on Friday, we'll go over chapter 3. The second half of the alphabet will be in person. And the first half of the alphabet on Friday will be on Zoom. So everybody's getting one lecture that's in person during the week. On Wednesday, we'll have a lab. The first half of the alphabet will be there from 1:15 to 2 o'clock. The other half of the lab comes in at 2:10, I believe, and they will be doing that for 45 minutes. The 10 minutes just allows for the transition, and so that I can wipe down the tables and things like that. When we are in person, I did try and socially distance the tables as much as possible, but please still wear a mask for your own safety in the classroom and to and from the classroom. Can we chat with you briefly after class? Sure. Sounds fun. All right, any other questions? 2:35 on a Friday? Yeah, everybody feeling good? Mentally, hopefully physically as well? Good, well, have a great weekend. I will see all of your faces, at least from the neck up, on Monday. And just email me if you have any questions. Stay after on this Zoom call. You can exit if you're done with hearing my voice. That sounds good too. Or you can stay after and briefly chat. If you need help finding the assignment,